Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and this week's episode is a classic level up episode. We're going to be talking about a very evergreen topic for Limited, and that's card evaluation. So the thing that really inspired me to make this episode right now is last week I posted a video to the YouTube channel. Not one on the podcast feed, by the way, so if some of the podcast listeners might not have caught this one, but I posted a video talking about 10 cards from Lord of the Rings. 5 cards that were good cards, strong cards, and 5 cards that weren't so strong cards. And the idea of the video was basically a mini level up episode, right? Using some of the cards from Lord of the Rings that I know people generally overrate or underrate to kind of find the discrepancies on why people are overrating or underrating those types of cards. And one of the cards that I mentioned is, of course, the ever-contentious Mirkwood Bats, and I explained that a big reason why the card was an underperformer in Lord of the Rings Limited is that it's a 4-mana 2/3 flyer, and that's just not a very good stat line as a baseline. And I had a lot of comments for that video saying, hey, this was a very helpful video. Usually people just, I ask, why is this card bad? And people will say, well, that's just a bad card, or just read the card, you'll figure it out. But that's not very helpful, right? And people were saying, I didn't realize how bad of a stat line 4-mana 2/3 flyer was as a baseline. And then follow-up comments were, well, if I have this wrong, now I'm wondering, where else do I need to tune up my card evaluation skills? What other types of cards might I be overvaluing or undervaluing? And that's what this episode is going to be. I'm going to go over as many different card types as I can, talk about what an acceptable baseline for a card is in Limited in 2023, because that changes, right? As design philosophies change, power creep happens. So even if you're a player who's been playing a long time, these card evaluation baselines, they're going to change. So I'm going to talk about aspects of different types of cards that people tend to overrate, underrate, and I'm going to be pretty thorough here. When I say I'm going to be going over a bunch of different card types, I'm not just talking about creature, instant, sorcery. I'm talking about what you should expect from your 2-mana creature versus your 6-mana creature. What kind of creature keywords are the most valuable, the different types of removal spells and their pros and cons, how you should evaluate counterspells, equipment. If you've been here before, you know me. I'm going to try to cover as much as I possibly can about this topic, not just covering on the basics. So buckle up. I think this episode is going to be a lot of fun, and I think it's going to be good, not just for beginning or intermediate players, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to provide a good baseline for a lot of those kind of players, but I think this episode is also going to be pretty good for players who have been playing a long time. In some ways, playing a long time can actually hurt your card evaluation skills, because you read a card and you're like, oh, that's a pretty good card. I played with that card before, that kind of card, but that format that you played, that you remember that card from was from like 7, 8, 9 years ago, and things have changed. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And of course, just before I jump in, gotta shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limited level ups. Really does help the show keep on running. All the support we get over there each week. I want to give a big thank you for everybody who chooses to support. If you like the show, if you feel like you've learned something, you leveled up a little bit, maybe you won a few more of your drafts, go check it out. Not only does it support the show, but there's a bunch of awesome reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support. So thank you for checking it out. All right, so let's jump in. I have some thoughts that I want to share about card evaluation, just to sort of frame our conversation today. As we talk about card evaluation today in today's episode, the goal isn't going to be necessarily to get into every nook and cranny, every corner case of where a card could be good, or how to make a card that other people don't value in the draft highly, turn that into a good card. That's maybe for another show. Today's focus is much more about baseline evaluations, talking about individual cards, understanding what good baselines for a card are, so that you know that when you look at a card, hey, I should expect to get this much out of it for the mana I'm paying, or I'm happy that I'm getting more than the mana I'm paying, or I'm not so happy about, getting whatever deal I'm getting on this card. Hey, that's a below rate. I don't actually like that card very much as a baseline, though. Once you understand the baseline of what you should be getting for the mana you're spending, then you can go, okay, well, maybe I'm not getting as much as I would like for the mana, but in my deck, I think I have enough stuff going on that that's okay. The synergy aspect makes up for the fact that I'm playing a card that is, below rate, quote unquote. And rate just means like, when they talk about rate in R&D at Wizards, they're generally referring to cards that are like on rate or above rate or below rate. So, I'm today going to be talking about what you should expect is an on-rate card for whatever given mana cost. And anything above that is good, and anything below that is bad. And I'm sure I'm going to say rate at some point today. So I thought I should just, clarify that if you're not familiar with the terminology. And that's the cool thing about Magic, right? Like, mostly I am just looking for cards that are on or above rate. But format context matters. The context of your decks can matter. So you can have a card, this is one of my favorite examples that I always use, Otherworldly Gaze, which is a card from Midnight Hunt, single blue mana instant, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put any of them into your graveyard, the rest back into your library, any order, has flashback so you can cast from your grave for 1 in a blue. This is a card that you evaluate just on rate, like what are you getting for the mana you're paying? You're paying a mana to not even get a card back, you're just looking at some cards, putting some cards in the graveyard. You can do it again, but you're not really, I would expect to get a little bit more. This is not a very good card in the abstract. You shouldn't just put this in any of your blue decks. But even though that's true, it's not a very good rate. There were a lot of decks in Midnight Hunt where you had 6, 7, 8 disturbed creatures, and you would just cast this as you put a bunch of disturbed creatures and flashback cards in your graveyard. You essentially draw them, right? So if you're getting to the point in your deck where you've got that critical mass of stuff that you can actually cast from your graveyard, well, Otherworldly Gaze is actually a pretty good card. And you compare that to a card like Falcon Abomination, which is 2 in a blue for a 2/2 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 decayed zombie token. Well, that's a much better card and generally a higher pick in that format. But there are decks that you can give me where at the end of the draft, you say, hey, do you want a Falcon Abomination or do you want an Otherworldly Gaze? It's not going to be a lot of them, but Otherworldly Gaze is going to be my pick in a deck that meets that critical threshold of a bunch of Disturb and a bunch of flashback cards. You have to be careful here, and this is what I always warn about. You have to make sure that the synergy or the payoff you're getting is actually worth the hit and rate to the card, right? For me to confidently say, yes, I want Otherworldly Gaze in my deck instead of Falcon Abomination, which is just generically a much better card, I have to be confident that every time I draw Otherworldly Gaze, or at least, close to every time, it is going to perform better than Falcon Abomination would be, so it's going to draw me, quote unquote, 2 to 3 cards on average for 3 mana, and that is a good rate, right? If you're turning Otherworldly Gaze into a 3 mana draw 3 or 4, that is actually a really good rate, and better than what you'd expect for Falcon Abomination, but you need to make sure that in your deck, you're actually reaching that ceiling, and if you're not reaching that ceiling, then you're kind of just making a deck building mistake. You should just play the Falcon Abomination. You shouldn't take the Otherworldly Gaze from that person that's offering you. And by the way, I'm using this example of somebody offering you because you'd never actually have to make this draft pick. You would never actually need to draft Otherworldly Gaze over Abomination. You could probably, if they're in the same pack, you just take the Abomination, wheel the Gaze. I'm just trying to show how the value of a card can change given the context of your deck. Another way to think about this is thinking about the average case of a card versus the ceiling of a card and how easy or not easy it is to reach that ceiling. Magic cards are always going to have an average case. You show me a Magic card, I'm going to tell you, on average, it's going to perform about this well in this format in most decks. And a good way to get this average is look at the game in hand win rate on 17 lands. It's not going to be perfect. There's some kind of factors in there that won't account for, but just a general, hey, how good is this card on average in most decks? Look at that game in hand win rate on 17lands.com. But while all Magic cards have an average case of how good they are, their rating is not static. They don't have static cases, right? I can never tell you this is always going to perform like this. I can only tell you a certain card will perform like this on average or at what its ceiling is. So your goal as an evaluator, as a drafter, as a deck builder, is going to be to figure out the average case of a card and then add or subtract modifiers on top. Because again, it's never static. You need to identify in your given position in a draft, in a deck, how well will that card perform for you. An example might be you have a pick in Lord of the Rings. You have Fiery Inscription, which is the 3 mana build around enchantment that enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you, and then whatever you cast an instant or sorcery, Inscription deals 2 to each opponent. Versus Smite the Deathless, which is just the 2 mana deal 3. Well, generally I take Fiery Inscription over Smite the Deathless because within the context of Lord of the Rings, the spells-based deck is pretty darn strong, and I think that I can reasonably draft a deck with 13, 14 plus spells in it to make Inscription a better card than Smite the Deathless. I am relatively confident that I can reach that ceiling where Smite the Deathless, sure, in a deck where you have no other instant or sorceries, or maybe even 8 or 9, Smite the Deathless is going to be better than Fiery Inscription. And that's a judgment call I'm making in the moment when I draft Fiery Inscription. I'm saying to myself, hey, I can actually get this to its ceiling given the card pool available. But then you swap out Smite the Deathless for Eomer of the Rittermark, which is the best uncommon in the set. It's the 5 mana 5/4 haste, and when it attacks, if it has the greatest power or is tied for the greatest power among creatures you control, you make a 1/1. Would I ever take Fiery Inscription over Eomer? Not early on, certainly not, and probably not later either, because maybe in the the absolute busted blue-red deck where you have all the pieces you need, Fire Inscription is about as good as Aomer, or maybe even slightly better. But to me, Aomer, on average, when you draw that card, even in a good blue-red spells deck, and this just speaks to the power of how good this card is, because it's a great creature, and I would happily play this in my very, very heavy blue-red spells decks and not even think twice about it. Aomer is going to be better on average, I believe, every time I draw it. So I'm always going to draft Aomer higher than Fiery Inscription. However, if I wasn't informed on this format and I didn't know just how good Aomer was, I might think, I'm drafting blue-red, I see this pick, and I go, okay, I'm drafting blue-red, I should draft Fiery Inscription. And I think if someone were to make that pick, they took Inscription over Aomer, that would probably be a failing of the understanding of Aomer at its baseline, because Aomer at its baseline is phenomenal, and it's going to be good every single time you cast it. Another way I've heard this described, and this is from Sam Black, he puts it in terms of words versus numbers. And he was talking about how some players are more predisposed to looking at the words on a card and evaluating them on what they do, what their type line is. If they're the type of player to first pick a build around and be like, oh, I just want to take all the cards that say to do this thing. And there are some players who really evaluate their cards based on the numbers, the rate, like I was talking about. And you can put two people in a draft seat and you say, you draft just based on words. You take the elf build around, you're taking everything that sells elf, forget about how good you think the card is, but it says elf, so it's going to matter, right? Versus you say to somebody, hey, don't worry too much about how your cards interact. Just take the best rate card in your colors in every single pack. Where would both players end up at the end of the draft? Well, the person who, let's just again use the Fiery Inscription versus Aomer pick. Let's take the person who is drafting just on words. Well, what's going to happen? They're gonna have a deck that's very, very good when they draw their Fiery Inscription because, they're gonna cast it in every single card in their deck, or almost every single one is gonna be spells, but they might run into the problem of, hey, sometimes I don't draw my Fiery Inscription or my other spells payoffs. Or maybe I drafted cards that were a little bit too below rate, a few too many cards that were like, yeah, this is a spell, but it's actually not a very good spell. So while it plays well with Fiery Inscription, when I don't draw Fiery Inscription, it's gonna be a little bit awkward. But this deck, when it draws Fiery Inscription, it's going to be fantastic. And maybe you pick up 2 copies and your deck is quite good. Versus the person that drafted the Aomer first. And they go on the path of, hey, Aomer doesn't push me down any particular path. It's just a good card. I don't have to have a specific deck for it. Every single pick of the draft, I'm just going to be taking cards that give me the most bang for my buck, regardless of how they play with each other. The advantage of that deck is you don't really care about the order you draw your cards in because they're generally just going to be all pretty good. They don't need to have certain cards interacting. But the problem with it, it's probably going to lack some synergy. It's probably not going to, its cards probably aren't going to play as nicely together as, you would like. Sets are designed these days in a way where it's hard for your cards not to play well together. You draft red and green cards, they're gonna fall into what the red-green deck of the set wants. But sometimes you do fall into this trap of like, okay, well, yes, I'm vaguely synergistic, but I did pick a few of the wrong cards. There were some opportunities for me to get even deeper, have better synergies, stronger synergies, where I should have taken X card over Y card, but since I was purely drafting on numbers, just like taking the best rate cards, I missed out on that. So of course, the answer here is there's a happy medium. You want to take cards that are good on rate, but are also synergistic. Also, the words play nicely together. And the way that I draft personally is, I tend to be a little bit more towards the number side of things. I like good rate, and then if there's synergy on top, that's great. I think you fall into some traps sometimes if you draft the other way, where it's like, okay, I'm taking cards that have good words on them. They care about spells, they care about elves, they care about zombies. But, I had drafted too many expensive cards. Or, maybe I just didn't draft enough interaction, because, hey, that interaction doesn't say zombies on it, So it's all about some kind of happy medium, and there are some risks of going one way or the other too far, right? If you're evaluating just based on the numbers, like I might tend to, it might take you a while to value a card like Breaking of the Fellowship as highly as you should, or, at least a little bit higher than I was before. Breaking of the Fellowship, which is the one in red sorcery, target creature an opponent controls deals damage equal to another creature that player controls and the ring tempts you. This is a card that, if I'm just evaluating this before I play the set, maybe I don't have a great idea of how good the ring tempts you is on a card. This is not a very good card. We've seen this kind of card before, whether it be Mutiny or Incriminate, a lot of analogs. And while the rate on this card isn't that good, the words on the card are good, because we know that things that tempt you are very, very strong. Versus something like Hardrim Spearmaster, which is the 2 and a red for a 2/3 reach at the beginning of combat in your turn. You pump another creature, gives +1/+0. That's a perfectly solid magic card, and that's a card that has been good in other formats. But a lot of the time, I'll pick Breaking of the Fellowship over Spearmaster, and I've only come to that conclusion after playing a bunch and realized, oh, I need to fine-tune. I'm somebody who drafts more on numbers, on raw rates, rather than on what the words of the card say a lot of the time, and I needed to adjust that a little bit. The flip side of that is you're somebody who overly drafts on words. You're really like, oh, I'm not caring too much about the rate of the card. I have this Arwen pick one, pack one, and maybe you even got another Arwen, like the blue-green signpost uncommon, and you just draft all the Scry cards, and you put a bunch of Galadriel guides in your deck, and the Grey Havens Navigators, and you're just playing too many cards that just are below rate. We don't like Galadriel Guide or Grey Havens Navigator. The only reason you would play that is because you have the Scry synergies. You end up with that Fire Inscription situation once again, where it's like, hey, yeah, like your Galadriel guys and Grey Havens Navigators are going to be pretty good when you draw Arwen, but they're not going to be good when you don't draw the Arwen, and you need to have that balance of having enough cards in your deck that you're just happy to draw without anything else going right. You just draw the card and it's good. And that's the problem with the Scry deck in this format, that too many of the cards aren't just good, quote unquote, when you draw them. You need your synergy pieces. And so all of this is basically just set up for my main point here, is that understanding the baseline of a card, understanding what you should be getting for the mana you're paying, understanding, hey, if I just put this card in my deck, how well will it perform regardless of anything else in my deck? That's really important when you're trying to take the next step to apply synergy, to put some cards that aren't just good in a vacuum. You need to know how much you're giving up. And of course, that's very difficult if you don't know the baselines for card evaluation, what you should expect to get for your mana. All right, and now time to jump into the meat of it all. We're going to start with the most common card type in Limited, which is creatures, of course. And one of the most foundational ways to evaluate creatures, and I'm sure the way that a lot of people were taught to evaluate creatures in Limited, is using the vanilla test. And it's a tried and true method. It's one that I think still holds a lot of weight today. For those not familiar with the vanilla test, all it is saying you look at the mana cost of a card, and there's a certain power and toughness you should expect for that mana cost. And it's roughly in line with mana cost equals the power and toughness. So 2 mana 2/2, 3 mana 3/3, 4 mana 4/4. Although you can shift the power and toughness a little bit, subtract the power somewhere, give a toughness to something. For example, 3 mana 2/4 is still going to be pretty good. And it used to be, when you got a creature, and it used to be, I'd say 5-10 years ago, you saw a 3 mana 3/3 and you're like, oh, that's good. 3 mana 4/3/3, like, I like that. The vanilla test was, it doesn't have that stats, that means it's good. 4 mana 4/4, that's just pretty good. These days, though, it's almost more of a prerequisite for the card to be good, right? To have stats that match its mana cost. If it's understated by a little bit, even like a 2 mana 2/1 or a 3 mana 3/4, its abilities have to be able to make up for that, right? Otherwise, it's just shooting below par, basically. It's just already a card I'm not that interested in because it's not able to keep pace with what the opponent's doing. And keeping pace with the opponent is the driving factor for why the vanilla test really matters. I think time and time again, we've just seen modern Limited Magic is about keeping pace with the opponent. Your opponent plays a 2/2, you play something that matches them that can block it. Your opponent plays a 3-drop, you do the same. And if you're playing well-statted creatures and your opponents are playing understated creatures, even with, an ability that might be good as the game goes on, they're going to fall behind on curve, right? Your, tokens are going to be able to attack past their 2/1s. If they play a 3 mana 2/3 or something, then your 3/3 start to get in. So every point in the curve, if you're playing something that's a little bit smaller than you would expect, that opens up an opportunity for the opponent to attack into you. You really want to be on turn 3, putting up enough stats where your opponent's 2-drop gets blanked. On turn 4, doing the same. You play a 4 mana card, that blanks their 3 and their 2. When you play something that is smaller, for example, Mirkwood Bats, it's very funny this card keeps coming up during this podcast, but I think it's a really good example. You play a Mirkwood Bats on turn 4, your opponent goes, great, my 3-drop can now attack into you. And that's what we get into talking about failing the vanilla test. And, I think a lot of the traps or a lot of cards that people overrate do fall into this category. Something like Renata, which is what I went on and on about for March the Machine. Now, this card was super overrated. The reason being, it's a 4 mana 3 toughness creature. And when this comes down on curve, by the way, for those listening, Renata, 2 green, X3, Renata's power is equal to your devotion to green, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Reads pretty well, right? You play it on turn 4, over time, your creatures are going to be bigger than your opponents, but you're taking a big risk. I would call it a risk when you play this on turn 4 as a 4 mana X3 that doesn't block that well. You're hoping to untap with it to get some value, and that, again, is an opportunity for your opponent to go, oh, great, you played something understated. I can start attacking you. I can start pressuring you. Another example is something like Faramir, Field Commander. This is the 3 and a white 3/3 from Lord of the Rings that At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died on your controller's turn, draw a card, and if the ring tempts you, you can choose something other than Faramir, and you got a 1/1. I mean, this one kind of sort of makes up for the fact, but it sometimes has an enter the battlefield effect. But a lot of the time, you're going to be playing the naked Faramir. You're going to be playing the 4 mana 3/3, doesn't get its trigger. You're hoping to untap with it. You don't really want to block with it. And that's a point that I think people don't realize that they start to lose the game when their 4 mana or 3 mana card doesn't block the earlier creatures. Just to show how important this is, you have something like Brandywine Farmer, right? And going back to the words versus numbers, Brandywine Farmer is the unplayable common from this set, is the 2 and a green 1/1. When it ETBs or it dies, you create a food token. So if you're just looking at the words on this card, and you cover up the power and toughness, cover up that 1/1 text box that is not very nice. If I read this card and you didn't tell me the power and toughness, I'd be like, oh, I'm actually kind of interested in that card. But the problem is, it's a 1/1, so it's got to pull a lot of weight. The ability is good, the words are good, but the numbers on this card aren't very good. You know how you make Brandywine Farmer a good card? You make it a 2/3. You make it a 3/2. It would be an actively good card. That's how much this power and toughness stuff matters. So you can read the card and be like, okay, yeah, that can do some cool things, but I don't think people put enough weight, enough gravity on what power and toughness they're getting for their mana cost. Another good example of this, something like Treason of Isengard, which is a 2 and a blue sorcery, put up to 1 instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library, you amass Orcs 2. That effect, you can imagine it being pretty good. You get to top the best card you've cast that game, or the best spell anyway, best instant or sorcery. That's generally going to be a good effect. If this amassed 3, I'd be all over it. Of course, that'd probably be a little bit too pushed, but as a 3 mana 2/2, I'm not into this card. It's not a card I really ever want to play in my deck. Even when you've got like the Gandalf Sanction stuff going on, usually I'll try to avoid this card. I think it's just too poor of a rate. But of course, power and toughness is not everything, and a bad power and toughness box can be overcome by a good Enter the Battlefield effect. And one of the things for evaluating cards in 2023 Limited is that Enter the Battlefield effects are really, they're just king. They really are. The good ones anyways. Stuff that draws you a card when it enters. Organ Hoarder, Inspiring Overseer, Sorrel's Packmate. Stuff that either kills a creature when it comes in or bounces a creature. Your Mana War variants, your Psychic Pickpockets, or something that gains a lot of life, like Ravenous Lindworm, 6 mana 6/6, you gain 4 life. Now, the tricky thing is, a good Enter the Battlefield effect won't always make up for a bad body necessarily. Something like Vine Shaper Prodigy from DMU, which is the 2 mana 2/2 kicker, 1 in a blue, that when it enters, if it was kicked, so if you paid 4 mana, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your library and you pick one of those, put them in your hand. It's still probably a little bit underrated. Like, the Enter the Battlefield effect pulls some weight, but you're still paying 4 mana for a 2/2. When it's like 4 mana for a 3/3 draw card, like Sorrel's Packmate from Kaldheim, or even a 3/2 as Organ Hoarder, because 3/2 as a 4 mana 3/2, that trades with your opponent's other creatures a lot easier than a 2/2, right? You can actually get a card's worth of value. It's not a 2-for-1 if your body is too small, right? Because then you can't use the body for anything. But anyways, just talking about Enter the Battlefield effects in general, most of the best commons in every color in every set are the creatures, the value-generating creatures, the creatures with the good Enter the Battlefield effects. And I had somebody ask me the other day, hey, why isn't green very good in Lord of the Rings? And why hasn't it been good, actually, for quite a few years? It's often been one of the lesser colors in the set as far as how good the commons are. And I think the real issue is there's somewhat of a resistance. I'm not sure the exact, reasoning behind this. I do not work at Wizards, but it seems there is somewhat of a resistance to giving green good Enter the Battlefield effects. The sets that do have good green Enter the Battlefield effects, like Kaldheim with Ravenous Lindworm and Packmate, green tends to pay up pretty good. But take this set, take Lord of the Rings. There's pretty much no good Enter the Battlefield effects at common in green, right? Nothing at the same level as you get from some of the red or the black or the blue cards in this set, and so it tends to fall behind. This is a really good indicator, I think, of how strong a color is going to be at common. There's actually somebody in the Limited Level Ups Discord, Danelius, who puts together a cube. I believe it's either a pauper cube or commons and uncommons. And one of the difficulties, and the way he constructs it, is he looks on 17 lands just to kind of see, what are the best commons in each color in each set. And he was telling me that there is a notable difficulty trying to find good green creatures, good green commons, because, like I was mentioning, there really isn't that many that fall into this camp of just good Enter the Battlefield effect. And to spell it out, the reason these kind of creatures are so good, creatures with good Enter the Battlefield effects, is you get to have your cake and eat it too. When you cast something like a Faramir or like Renata, you don't want to get that involved in combat very often, right? You don't want to be attacking with your small creature. I mean, you can't attack with your small creature a lot of the time because it just gets blocked. Or, you don't want to block with the turn it comes down. You sometimes don't even want to send it into combat on an empty board because you don't want to get your value creature gotten by one of the, destroy target attacking creatures or a flash spell or something like that. With something like an Organ Hoarder or a Lindworm or a Packmate or whatever, you don't really care that much what happens to the creature. You can enter it in combat and feel pretty good about it. And that's just not true for creatures with static abilities. Those ones you have to dance around a little bit. You have to, kind of set up in a lot of ways. These creatures just do their thing. I think maybe another way to put this is people value enter the battlefield effects and static abilities roughly the same when they're looking at a card and evaluating it. And I think enter the battlefield effects are just much, much better. And I don't think everybody is quite caught on to that. So we've got passing the vanilla test is a good thing. We've got enter the battlefield effects are a good thing. And tied to enter the battlefield effects, a variant of an enter the battlefield effect is creatures that create multiple bodies. Stuff like Preening Champion, Dunlin Crabane, Chimney Rabble is the 4-mana 3/3 that has haste, and when it HEBs, you make a 1/1 from Phyrexia Albi-1. We've seen time and time again that cards that make multiple bodies for one card that are still, decently statted, Chimney Rabble, 4 mana for 4/4 with the stats. Preening Champion, Dunlane Crabane, you're getting 3 mana for 3/3 with the stats. They always overperform. These are good cards. And the reason that they're good is they're modular. They let you block with one half of them, attack with the other half. They let you sacrifice half of it. You're only down half of a card, and maybe that sacrifice effect is a really powerful effect. Power and toughness divided across multiple bodies just gives you more options. It lets you stabilize on a board that your opponent is attacking you. Right? Your opponent aggressively casts a removal spell on your 3-drop, gets in with their 2 and their 3. You untap, you play one of these creatures that make multiple bodies, and your opponent goes, well, that was really bad for me because I used my removal spell and I was hoping to just push through, attack past their blockers, but now they have multiple blockers, right? So that's a real inflection point in the game when your opponent plays one of these. And of course, they're good when pressuring too. An opponent with a bunch of removal spells in hand, that's not going to line up very well against a Preening Champion or a Rabble, or if they're planning just to block with 1 or 2 big things where you can go wide on them. So just anything that makes multiple bodies, that should set off a red flag for you as, oh, this card's probably really good. Chimney Rabble is a card that was really, really underrated for quite a long time in Phyrexia Albi-1. And I think even at the end of the format, it was still underrated. People didn't quite grasp just how good making multiple bodies for its appropriate mana cost. You're still getting 4 mana worth of stats, 4/4 for 4, but across multiple bodies really makes the difference. So now I want to talk quickly about what you're looking for cheap creatures, mid-sized creatures, and large creatures. The cheap creatures have a much lower barrier to entry than the expensive creatures, just in general. You have to be less picky about your cheap cards, more picky about your expensive cards, but there are definitely still some traits that you're looking for in your cheap cards too. So number 1, a good cheap card is good early and good late. Good on turn 1, good on turn 2, and I say cheap, I'm mostly talking, 1, 2, 3 mana cards. These cards are good when you draw them early and pretty darn good when you draw them late still. A good example here, one of my favorite cards, one of my favorite limited commons is Fairy Guidemother. This is from Eldraine, single white mana for a 1/1 flyer. Has an adventure you can cast before you cast the 1/1 flyer, and it says target creature gets +2/+1 against flying until end of turn, and it costs 1 and a white. It's a sorcery. You draw that on turn 1, you just play it on turn 1. It's a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. It's going to be responsible for 4 or 5 points over the course of the game in a white aggressive deck. You draw this on turn 7, well, it's still going to be good, because it's still probably going to be responsible for that amount of damage, right? Because you jump your 4-power creature, and then the Guidemother pecks in for a bit. Another good example, Gustwalker from Amonkhet. 1 and a white 2/2. When it attacks, you can exert it, which means it doesn't untap during your next untap step, and it gets +1/+1 in flying. Good on turn 2. Good when you draw it late. It's not that common that you get 2-drops that are good both early and late. So when you do find a card like that, that should raise an eyebrow for you. That should be like, okay, that's something I'm interested in. Another characteristic of a cheap card that's really good is something that helps you snowball. So in Lord of the Rings, some examples might be March of the Black Gate, the 1 in a black enchantment that amasses 1 whenever this enters or whenever you attack. Meriadoc Brandybuck, the 1 in a green 2/2, the whenever a halfling you control attacks, you make a food token. You really don't want to have that snowballing, making 3 food before you could actually block it. A Mana Dork, something like what was Pathfinder that ramps you early, and this falls into the category of what I was talking about before, good early, good late. Pathfinder, you draw it on turn 2, great, you play it, it's gonna help jump your hand. You draw it later, well, it's pretty good too. You've got this threatening 7-mana ability to give something +3/+3 and trample. And then when you move to the mid-sized creatures, this is where we're talking 4-drops and 5-drops. two main things that your 4 and 5 drops really need. And one of them is a little more context dependent than another, but in every format, your 4 and 5 drop creatures either have to block well when they come down or have a good enter the battlefield effect. And they could be both, of course. You know, I mentioned Renata before, a card that doesn't block very well. Farmir is another example. Organ Hoarder, which, again, a reminder maybe for those who haven't played, this is 4 mana, 3 and a blue for a 3/2 at common. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the rest in your graveyard. This one's good too, because when I say blocks well, I don't necessarily mean it comes down and it literally blanks everything. It's just gigantic and, you know, all the 2s and 3s and 4s can't attack into it. I'm just saying, am I okay blocking with this card the turn it comes down? It's something that generates value, you're okay with it. Something that's large in toughness, you're also okay with this. You know, 4 toughness creature for 4. But then you also have stuff with good death triggers. And death triggers, I would count that too. Something like Warbeast of Gorgoroth, which is the 4 and a red 5/4. When it dies, or another creature with power 4 or greater dies, you amass orcs too. You're okay blocking with this too, because if it does happen to get gotten by a trick, or you have to trade down your opponent's 4 mana creature can attack into it, you still get a little bit of value. The thing you're really just trying to avoid with your 4 and 5 mana creatures is you don't want to have to untap with them to do something good. You want them to just do their thing. You're already spending a premium. You're spending a good amount of mana, likely your whole turn. That thing has to be impactful. And then in some formats, not only is it important that your 4 and 5 drops block, it's important that they're resilient to removal too. So March of the Machines had this kind of dynamic, Midnight Hunt had this dynamic, where if a format has enough good cheap removal, then your 4 and 5 drop creatures are even more pressured to have enter the battlefield effects, because you're not only just worried about them trading down with your opponent's attacking creatures, you're worried about them trading down with a 2 mana removal spell or a 3 mana removal spell. You cast a 5 drop creature with no ETB, your opponent goes, all right, 2 mana, bounce it. Or, there's formats with just like a lot of good 3 mana catch-all interaction, like Midnight Hunt and like March of the Machine was a lot of good cheap interaction. So when there is a lot of good cheap interaction, that's another axis that you will start losing on that you might not necessarily notice if you're just playing a bunch of 4 and 5 mana cards that don't generate value, because you lose a mana advantage, right? Your opponent casts a 2 mana removal spell on your 5 drop, that's pretty bad for you. So I think out of all the spots in the curve, the 4 and the 5 mana slots are the slots that I choose to play the most different cards or draft the most different cards compared to where I see other people drafting cards or where they're prioritizing them, because I am more picky. I am quite picky about my 4 and 5 mana slot. Needs to block well, and like I mentioned, sometimes they also have to be resilient to interaction spells, because that's a recipe for setting yourself up to fall behind if they're not. And then, that continues as you get to the more expensive creatures, the 6 drops, the 7 drops. When you're playing cards that cost 5+ mana, a higher cost has to have a higher impact. Otherwise, why are you playing this card? I think there's something that says to people, oh, I need some expensive cards in my deck so I can have some high impact cards. That's true if the expensive card is good. Something like Voracious Fellbeast, something like Troll of Khazad-dûm. These are high impact cards. But when you're talking about things that are like, a 6 mana 6/6, even something like the Fabled Colossal Dreadmaw, 6 mana 6/6 trample, that's okay these days, but you definitely want to be asking for more out of your cards. And that's something I say a lot. Ask for more out of your cards. Don't just settle. Next up, let's talk about flyers. So I think there's this prevailing wisdom that flying is a good keyword in Limited, which it is to some degree, but just like anything, there can be bad versions and good versions. The good versions of flying are when they're very cheap, something very efficient. You get down early, it starts beating down. Something like Skyclave Aerialist, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 flyer. That's a good rate. But once you start getting to like 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer, the Windrake territory, that doesn't count as, flying's good and limited, because that's just a bad rate, When you get to the really expensive stuff, too, you usually get some good stuff. You get these, dragons that uncommon and rare that are usually pretty good. I'm going to use the example once again of Voracious Fellbeast, has a good enter the battlefield effect. Giant flyers are pretty good. But I think what you really have to worry about is the mid-size flyers. Again, going back to the 4 and 5 mana cards, I think people aren't picky enough about. Stuff like, hey, say it with me again, Mirkwood Bats. Stuff like Willow Wind, which is the 5 mana 4/3 flyer that scries 2 and enters. Stuff like Meneldor, the 4 mana 3/3 flyer that when it deals damage, you blink something. These cards, they're all below rate. So this is kind of, hopefully this point here is a culmination of everything I've been talking about. Why these cards? I'm hoping this is a point in the episode of the podcast that you're like, oh, I get it now. I get why these cards aren't as good, because they don't block as well as they could when the turn they come down. You hope to have to untap with them. They're understated. It's all these things that I think people underrate or undervalue the magnitude of how bad they are if you have too many cards in your deck that are like this. because you start to fall behind. So when you're evaluating a card, and it's one of these like 4-mana 3/3 flyers, which, 5 years ago, 6-7 years ago, that was a pretty good stat line. It's just a little bit too small now when you need to be keeping pace at every point. You're looking at something like a 4-mana 2/3 flyer, a 5-mana 3/4 flyer like Willow-Wind. These should set off alarm bells to you saying, well, okay, so you're giving me 5 mana or 4 mana for an understated creature. What else do you do? And in all 3 of these cases, I don't think the effects are generically good enough to call these generically good cards. Now, something like Menaldor, maybe you can have a deck where it just has a bunch of enter the battlefield effects, but that's still something you have to work towards. You have to put work in. You have to draft those cards. These aren't cards that you just put in your deck and are going to be good. Now, how do you fix this? Well, again, tying it back, it's all, it's so nice how Magic ties into each other nicely. How do you fix a poorly statted flyer? Well, you give it an enter the battlefield effect, of course. So, a recent example was Aeronaut Cavalry from Brothers War. This is the 5 mana 4 and a white 3/4 flyer, which is, just about where I'd want. You really want a 5 mana 4/4 flyer at a minimum, so it's only a little bit understated. But when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on a soldier you control. So now that's 4 or 5 worth of stats for your 5 mana, and that's good enough. Something like even Gaggle Master is maybe a good example. This one's going back a few years now, but this is 5 mana, 3 white for a 4/3 flyer. So again, just slightly understated, but when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life for each creature you control with flying. And in particular, gaining life is a nice combo with this creature that doesn't block very well. It's a 5 mana, 3 toughness creature, but you don't mind not blocking a turn or 2 if you're going to gain, 8 life off this thing in the right deck. Something like Blessed Hippogriff from Baldur's Gate. This is the 4 mana 2/3 flyer that when it attacks, another thing gains flying. That's almost good enough on its own, but it has the adventure side, Tyr's Blessing, instant single white mana to give something indestructible. That almost gives it sort of an enter the battlefield effect, gives you something additional on top of just the body. So just like anything, there's no absolute truths in saying flying is good and limited. Sure, some amount of flying, some flying creatures, it has the ability to be good if it's on a well-statted creature. But don't be fooled into thinking, okay, well, this creature is kind of small, but it has flying, so that makes up for it, right? It doesn't always at that middle mana value range. And this isn't to say that, you can never have a card that overcomes it by other abilities. Something like Xeric Strobe Knight, 3 mana 2/2 flyer with Vigilance. Okay, well, that's a little bit under what I would want, but it has that ability, tap to make a 2/2 if you've cast 2 spells this turn. Hey, that pushes it over the edge, right? So that's the kind of evaluation you want to do. Look at that baseline. Once again, that's what all today's about. Look at the baseline, see what you're getting on top of it. All right, so that's creatures. Now let's talk about removal spells. So let me give you a list of things I like in my removal spells. Cheap is good. Catch-all is good. The more creatures it can kill, the better. The wider array of creatures that it has targets for, the more times it'll be relevant. Instant speed really does matter because the difference between an instant speed removal spell and a sorcery speed removal spell, quite large. Mostly because an instant speed removal spell can net you a 2-for-1 when your opponent goes to put an aura on their creature, or in combat, they cast a combat trick, you blow them out, or you use an instant speed removal spell when your opponent goes for a double block. A sorcery speed removal spell just, can't do all that. And just like a lot of things we talked about today, I think there's this umbrella term that gets cast on removal, or flyers, or mana dorks. And just like flyers and mana dorks we've already talked about, not all removal is good just because it is removal. I like the cheap stuff. One of the better removal spells we've seen over the past little while is Infernal Grasp. 1 and a black, instant, destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. Cheap, catch-all. Yeah, it's got that lose 2 life downside, but that's okay. It's much, much, much different. And I know this is obvious to a lot of people, but I really just want to spell this out. Much, much, much different than something like Ready to Rumble, which is from New Capenna, 4 and a red, sorcery, deal 5 to a creature or a planeswalker, or destroy an artifact, which, that mode didn't come up all that much. So when you have in your head, okay, I'm trying to build my deck, I need to have some number of removable spells, I would put a caveat and say, you need to have some number of good removal spells. How many Ready to Rumbles do I need? Ideally none, right? Even if I don't have interaction spells, like if I don't have removal, I still don't want to play this clunky removal because I'd rather just play a good creature, right? Yes, would I prefer my deck to have some removal? Sure. But will I play a very bad removal spell over a good creature? I think some people would say yes, but I believe you shouldn't. I believe that it will be bad sometimes when your opponent plays a threat that you can't answer, but it's worse when just in an average game, you don't, there's no must-kill threats, and you've got this clunky 5-minute interaction spell how much better are you going to feel when it's just a good, efficient creature? Most of the time, that good, efficient creature is going to be better than the clunky removal spell. You just don't have to put removal spells in your deck if they're bad. Like, I know there is definitely some amount of emotional weight to being like, oh, but what if they play something that's really good? It's going to happen sometime. But I do believe you're better off just playing as many good cards as you can. And of course, different colors get different kinds of removal spells. So there's the fight spells or bite spells. Fight spells being the creatures deal damage to each other. Bite spells being your creature deals damage to theirs. I think generally these kind of cards are a little bit overrated too. Like, I'm often seeing bite spells, unless it's just like a really, really premium one. There are some sets that have really nice ones, especially at uncommon. But something like a Rabid Bite, just 2 mana, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. That's the kind of card I'm not all that interested in. I mean, it's a solid card, and we saw this card in Innistrad Remastered, but I believe I take this card a bit later than most people do, or this type of card. The reason being that it's a removal spell that, at its core, is risky to some degree. You know, it can get blown out by your opponent having a combat trick or, you know, a removal spell on your creature. I generally want to get my removal spells from the other color I'm playing, but, you know, if I don't have any, sure, I'll resort to the green ones here. They're fine. I just wouldn't put these on the same level as something, you know, nowhere close to something like Infernal Grasp, just the 2 mana instant destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. It's so much more situational than that, and it's in a subtle way, right? It's in ways that you don't necessarily see. It's in the 20% of times that you cast a spell and you get completely blown out. I mean, 80% of the time, sure, it's going to do its thing. It's going to be a removal spell. But 20% of the time, your opponent does have an answer to it. Or, you know, your opponent just, like, passes the turn with all their mana up. What are you going to do? Cast your Rabid Bite into their open mana? No, you're not going to do that. So it's a little bit awkward. So I'm not saying these bite spells are bad, but just value them a little bit lower than the removal spells that don't ask you to put something on the line. Bounce spells is another pretty big one. And I think bounce spells are pretty misunderstood. So when you have a card like Soothing a Smeagol, 1 in a blue, instant return target non-token creature to its owner's hand, the ring tempts you. Or maybe even more simple, just talk about unsummon, just single blue mana, return target creature to its owner's hand. These are the kind of cards that are better in aggressive decks than in controlling decks generally, because an aggressive deck, you go play a 2-drop, play a 3-drop, play a 4-drop, bounce your 4-drop, get in. That's going to be pretty effective. The creature can come back, of course, but that's okay. You know, you don't mind the creature coming back. You've already dealt a bunch of damage. In a controlling deck, a bounce spell like this, I prioritize much lower. And of course, Soothing a Smeagol has the ring tempts you aspect. We're going to ignore that for a second. But you don't really want this kind of effect in most controlling decks, or at least not in abundance. One copy as just like a cheap, you know, just gets you out of a tough spot, or it's very good paired with card draw. Like if you have a lot of card draw, say you have 3 Lorraine Reveals or something, I'm okay playing multiple Soothing a Smeagols, because if you're drawing a bunch of cards, you don't mind going down a card, and that's the problem with these bounce spells. You're going down a full card. You're not actually exchanging a card for their card. If you've got a lot of card draw, meaning you're going to be not affecting the board a lot and also have an excess of cards, it's okay to have a bounce spell. Because when you have a bounce spell, sure, it's not worth a full card, but you don't really care about it being worth a full card because you have just like infinite cards in hand. So generally these cheap bounce spells that you expect to pay 1 or 2 mana for, 1 for just like bouncing something, and 2 mana, usually you get a bit of a bonus. Those are the kind of cards that I prioritize for my aggressive decks and not for my more controlling decks. Now, a card like Lunar Rejection from Crimson Vow, which is essentially 4 mana, bounce a thing, and you draw a card. There's some, you know, rules and intricacies there that I'm not going to get into here. But essentially, there's a lot of cards that are like this, right? 4 mana, bounce something, draw a card. That is a card that's good in any deck. An aggressive deck, controlling deck. In the controlling decks, you don't mind just passing the turn, bouncing their thing. You get your card back. That's very nice. These cards are chronically underrated. Often when these are in sets, these kind of cards that draw a card and bounce them thing, I'll note it as, I know these cards are going to be underrated. I always say on the podcast, keep your eye out. Don't be one of the players who's underrating these cards. Tolarian Geyser is another good example. That one's a sorcery, and that still is good because bouncing plus drawing a card is just a really good combo. Then you've got cards, usually white removal spells that deal with tapped only creatures. So something like Banished from Idorus in this set, or Cut Short from the last set from Merchant of the Machine. These ones you should be cautious about. Just kind of like I had some apprehension with the green interaction spells. These ones, it's not so much there's risk you're taking on by casting it, but you have to be in a specific deck for these to be good. Namely, you don't want to be in an aggressive deck, because these only deal with tap creatures. your opponent's creatures aren't going to be tapped if you're the one pressuring them, because they're going to need to block. And you don't need to deal with the tapped creatures, you need to deal with the untapped creatures. So first and foremost, don't put these in aggressive decks. These are slower cards that are meant to deal with threats that are attacking you. Now, actually, a caveat to that is you can play these in decks with a lot of flyers if you're an aggressive flyer deck, because your opponent is going to be attacking you. You're attacking in the air. They're attacking on the ground, so, their things are going to turn sideways. And a note here, Cut Short being an instant is much better than something like Banish being a sorcery, because, of course, you can not take damage before that you get to cast this card. Usually with Banish, you have to take a hit off the card first, the creature that's attacking you. With Cut Short, it essentially says destroy target attacking creature, so you're a deck that's just holding up mana, and, you're a blue-white controlling deck, and you're just like, all right, come at me. And you cast Cut Short, and it's close to as good as something like Infernal Grasp. It's only 1 mana more. If you mostly care about dealing with threats and don't care that much about pushing early damage, getting blockers out of the way in the early game, yeah, these are going to be solid, but I just really wanted to point them out because I know there's a lot of people who, kind of like I was talking with the Ready to Rumble, just like, oh, it's removal, I'll put it in my deck. They see these the same, where it's like, oh, I don't have that much removal, I'll put this in my deck. I would advise against it unless you know you're a slow deck or a deck with a lot of flyers. And then, of course, we have the enchantment-based or aura-based removal spells, and you usually see these in white or blue. And you'll often hear myself and other content creators kind of talking these down. And it's not to say that they are unplayable, but they generally do have some issues, right? They have the issues of they sit on the battlefield, something like Planter Disruption or Fog on the Barrow Downs, which is much worse than Planter Disruption. But they have the issues of they sit there, they don't stop passive abilities. They don't stop. Some of them don't stop activated abilities. They can be sacrificed, so you're giving your opponent some value. Your opponent can blink them. They can bounce them. Basically, there's a lot of things that punish these types of cards. Now, are they always going to be bad? No. In fact, there are some versions, like Planter Disruption from All Will Be One. It's pretty good. It's only 2 mana. It hits artifact, creature, or planeswalker. And the enchanted permanent can't activate its abilities or attack or block before. That's the biggest thing, right? That's what you want out of your cards that look like this. Yes, they're going to be still open to all the opportunities for your opponent to kind of punish them, but they're giving you enough. They're shutting off abilities. They are 2 mana only. Then you compare it to, a card like Fog of the Barrow Downs from Lord of the Rings, and it doesn't do any of that. It's 3 mana, and it doesn't stop abilities. Much, much worse. Stuff like Banishing Light, which is 2 and a white enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent until Banishing Light leaves. This one I'm much less worried about because the only thing that really punishes this is a naturalize effect or something that gets rid of enchantments. The other cards are much more susceptible to getting punished, but Banishing Light, this is just going to be good. You're going to be happy with this kind of effect. Also, these play better in aggressive decks than they do in controlling decks. In aggressive decks, you don't give your opponent a lot of time to be able to punish you. Like, the worry with these cards is you play it on turn 4 on their 4-drop, and then 3 or 4 turns later, they find an answer to it, right? In your aggressive decks, you don't care that much because, number one, you're not going to give them that much time to find an answer or a way to punish you. And also, you really just care about cast Planter Disruption on your 4-drop, get in for a big hit. If you answer it in a turn or 2, that's okay. It's already kind of done its job. And this makes the blue versions of this effect, something like Charm Sleep, which is 1 blue, enchant a creature and you tap it and that creature doesn't untap, worse than the white versions generally, because the blue decks are often playing a long game, which means that, you give your opponent more time to find a card that punishes it. Whereas the white decks, they're not going to give their opponent as much time. So I think in general, just to cap off removal, at common, you usually don't get just like excellent removal spells that are just catch-all instants. And those are obviously the best kind. And then the cards that are kind of just a tier below those, like the fight spells, the bounce spells, the white destroy tap creatures, the enchantment-based removal spells. They're all going to have their pros, their cons, their problems. What you need to do is recognize what their cons are and how to play around them and how you want to play them best and what kind of decks you want to put them in. That's how you kind of break these evaluations. Because I'm saying all these things that I don't like them. I don't like this about this kind of card or this about this kind of card. This isn't saying that they're unplayable. It's just saying they have restrictions, unlike some of the best removal, and you have to understand the restrictions so you're not playing them in the wrong place or playing them in the wrong way. All right, and to round us out today, I want to talk about a few other card types that you'll find in your limited decks. I think creatures and removal spells, the cards that we spent the most time on, those make up generally most of your deck, but stuff like card draw, for example, does get in there too. So let's talk about some card draw. The vanilla test, as it were, for card draw generally is for 3 mana, you'll get 2 cards. And Divination used to be the gold standard, right? 3 mana, 2 and a blue, sorcery, draw 2 cards. Used to be a card you're pretty happy with. These days, you expect a little bit more. Maybe it's got a condition that if you meet the condition, you can cast it at instant speed. Or it's got, something like Phyrexian Espionage. It's got a kicker cost to make it scale with the game. Like, this is one of those things where if they could, they'd probably cost divination today in 2023 at fractional mana. It would be like 1.75 mana or something. But they can't do that, of course. They have to work in whole numbers. So instead, they give you a little bit of a boost. But 3 mana for 2 cards, it's still generally what you want. And then you scale up and you get to 3 cards. And 3 cards, you're usually paying 5 mana for. It's kind of the same, where ideally, I think you'd be putting like 4.5 mana or something, because not all 5 mana draw 3s are good cards. And in fact, in some formats, those are just not fast enough. It's basically too slow. You never really have time to tap out and draw 3 cards. But in formats like Lord of the Rings that are blistering, 5 mana, draw 3 cards with some upside. Island cycling on Lorien Revealed, for example. That's a nice bit of modality. It is some upside. 4 mana, you tend to get like a bunch of scry in the middle. So you get something like Arwen's Gift, which is scry 2, draw 2. Or like Tamio's Epiphany from War of the Spark, which is scry 4, draw 2. It's, again, they're really trying to like price it fractionally because they can't have you draw 3 cards for 4 mana at common generally. So they're trying to get you a little bit more card selection. And then we get to cantrips, which are a bit different than just raw 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 card draw spells, and you should think about them differently. I think people, when they say something like Opt, which is single blue mana, scry 1, draw a card, or, there's Consider, which is the same thing except you Surveil, or Birthday Escape, single blue mana, draw a card, the ring tempts you. Some players think of this as card draw, but when I think card draw, I'm thinking card advantage, right? And these cards, their role isn't to give you card advantage, to put you up on cards versus your opponent. Their role is more to add some consistency to your deck, right? You spend a mana, you get some consistency, get some card filtering, see the cards you need, find your lands. And in fact, when you have a lot of these kind of cards, you should cut a land generally. Like I'd say if you have 3 Birthday Escapes or Ops, you can generally cut a land because, after you're drawing, spending 1 mana draw a card, 1 mana draw a card, every time you do that, you're drawing a fraction of a land. So if you have 3 of them, you're going to start floating at some point, or 3 or more, I would say. So you can go to 16 lands when you've got, 3 Ops or 3 Birthday Escapes. That's generally acceptable. And past the, okay, well, I'm giving you some filtering, and I guess with Birthday Escape in particular, it's not actually giving you filtering, it's tempting you, which is a little bit different. But past that, where you want these cards is where you have Spells Matters cards, right? Stuff like Fiery Inscription, stuff like Gandalf Sanction. And this is true for every format. This isn't just Lord of the Rings. You get these kind of cards all over the place. But with those kind of cards, you want cheap cards that trigger whatever Spells Matter thing you have, that then find you more cheap cards, right? That's the idea. It's not just, well, I have X amount of spells in my deck. It's, I have this number of spells in my deck, and I'm seeing more of them because my Ops or Birthday Escapes draw me to additional copies. So it's the ability to cast a spell that you care about to dig to more spells that you then care about. That's a little bit what these cantrips are doing. Like in Constructed, they play multiple copies, like 4 Brainstorms, 4 Preordains, because if your deck can just be casting a bunch of these cards that go through your deck quickly and find you cards you need, you don't actually need that many threats or removal spells because you'll just find them all with these cantrips. You don't often have those setups in Limited, but it's kind of the same idea. Opposite side of the spectrum here, we've got discard spells. And discard spells in the past few years have kind of been on the up and up. It used to be that, the discard spells you'd find were just Mind Rot, which, 3 mana target player discards 2, or like stuff like Duress crowding up the pack. But they have, I think, made a conscious effort to make more playable hand disruption spells. And just like the blue card draw spells, there's kind of 2 variants. There's the I cast this card and you discard 2 cards or 3 cards, and there's the targeted I take a card out of your hand. So let's talk about both of them. Cards like Mind Rot, kind of like Divination, it's a bit past its prime. You're expecting a little bit more for the mana, and you do get on a lot of sets, something like Mind Rot, 3 mana, target player discards 2 cards, plus they mill a card, you gain a life, your opponent loses a life. There's that card in Zendikar Rising. That was one of the better black commons. So it's kind of the same thing with Divination. It's not a card, you wouldn't just play Mind Rot these days, but with a little bit of a bonus, it becomes a card you're looking for. Discard 2 spells are generally worse than draw 2. Like, Divination is just better than Mind Rot generally, because Mind Rot's good at any point in the game. You draw it early, cast on turn 3, helps you hit your land drops. You draw it late, great, you draw 2. Mind Rot's a bit more timing specific, right? You can't just cast it on turn 3 because your opponent has 7 or 6 cards in hand. They're like, okay, well, I get to discard my 2 worst ones. And sometimes you top deck Mind Rot when your opponent doesn't have anything in hand. So it's just like, okay, this doesn't do much. You really want to time the Mind Rot so that you get the last 2 or 2 of the last 3 cards out of your opponent's hand. Specifically the last two if you can, because, you know, them getting to cast, keep their best one is going to be kind of a problem for you. And then there's the stuff like Torment of Golem, where it's targeted hand disruption. And targeted hand disruption, like Thoughtseize and Constructed, for example. Single mana, take something from your opponent's hand. I would play Thoughtseize, my limited decks. I wouldn't play Duress, because Duress hits a too narrow of a range of cards. But Thoughtseize, I would just play most decks. And then something like Torment of Golem, it's that effect. You get to see your opponent's hand and a body, right? So like you were talking about earlier, where it's like, okay, well, you don't mind a slightly understated body if it comes with a good enter the battlefield effect. And I would say that the Torment of Golem is you're almost getting a little bit more than a card's worth of value from the look at your opponent's hand, take a card, because you get the information. Anytime you get to look at your opponent's hand and get the information of what they have, that's pretty big, because now you get to play around the cards they have better. You get to not walk your fight spell into their removal spell, stuff like that, right? So you do gain quite a bit there. Another thing that you like for these kind of targeted discard spells is that there's a buyout clause. Something like Traumatic Revelation from Mom. You look at your opponent's hand and you can take a creature or a battle, and if you don't, you get to incubate 3. So you draw this on, you know, your opponent has no cards in hand, you at very least get a 4-mana 3/3. So with your targeted hand disruption spells, you want it to hit as many things as you can. Torment of Golem hits anything, and with Traumatic Revelation, this was a good card too. It hits creatures or battles, which you'd most likely be hitting something in in the early game. And they either give you some sort of value, like a creature with Torment of Golem, or they give you a buyout clause with Traumatic Revelation. I think targeted hand disruption is the kind of effect that people tend to shy away from even a little more than they should, because they remember cards like Duress. Like, we don't really play those. Or there's a lot of variants of like 1 mana pseudo Thoughtseize, but I only take a small section of cards or a small array of cards, right? And that's just, those are a bit narrow, but I wouldn't shy away from these ones that give you the buyout clause, give you a creature, have a wide range of cards you can take. Those cards are pretty good still. Next up, we've got Combat Tricks, and I'm actually not going to go too deep on Combat Tricks today, because I have a whole Combat Trick episode if you want to go check that out. I think it's just called a deep dive on Combat Tricks. You can search that either on the podcast feed or on the Limited Level Ups YouTube channel. It's going to be there. Gives you the full rundown if you really want that deep dive. But one thing I will say about Combat Tricks in general is the cheaper, the better. One of the really nice things about Combat Tricks is when you're able to cast a Combat Trick plus play a creature in the same turn. You can't always do that with 2 mana, 3 mana Combat Tricks. The 1 mana Combat Tricks that, you know, give +2/+2, or something like Shalab's Ambush, +1/+2 Death Touch. You make a food. That's really, really what you're looking for. I think Combat Tricks are a deep enough topic that I'm not going to try to just like recount my full 50-minute long episode of when I talked about them. It is quite a deep topic, and if you want to check that out, I will link it in the description of this episode as well. Let's talk about Counterspells, because Counterspells are kind of like discard in a lot of ways, where I think people have heard advice that Counterspells aren't good in Limited, or maybe have some outdated advice. Again, this is another thing I would update for a 2023 Magic player who's maybe coming back in after a few years of being out. Counterspells, the cheap ones, tend to be just good these days. Like, one of the reasons that Counterspells, something like Essence Scouter, which counter target creature spell, or, you know, cancel variants, the 3 mana counter anything, usually with a bit of upside, they've gotten a boost in recent years because the cards they print around these cards tend to play better in these days in modern sets than they used to. You know, you didn't always used to have this nice instant speed package, this package of like 6-7 cards at common that played nicely with Counterspells, but you do a lot of the time. So don't be afraid of Counterspells, especially like Essence Scatter variants, Glorious Gale. Like, Essence Scatter was underrated in Dominaria United, Glorious Gale underrated in Lord of the Rings. So don't be a player who's like, oh, Counterspell, I heard you aren't supposed to play those Limited. It's okay to play them. And in fact, they're quite good. In fact, they're often some of the top commons in their colors. You just have to either, one, be playing them in a deck with a bunch of instants, so you don't walk into the problem of, oh, hey, my opponent didn't do anything and I just wasted mana, or they decided to play around it, or, you know, you just don't cast your Counterspells until later. You play to the board first, then you're like, all right, now I got my Essence Scatter up for your 6-drop or whatever. I also want to talk about cancel variants, like I mentioned a second ago. Just, cancel is just 1 blue instant counter target spell, but we usually still something with a little bit of upside, and cancel is just below the mark, I would say. Cancel is just below where I'd be like, yeah, I just like this card, it's just good. But you add a little something. You know, with Sorman's Trickery, you add a 1/1. That is enough to push it over the edge. You put Cycling on your Counterspell. That's enough to put it over the edge. We saw it in Ikoria. And I would say most of the time, they do a good job of making these Counterspells, these 1 blue Counterspells, hit their mark. Where it's like, yeah, the bonus they're giving you is enough better than just, one blue counter target spell, that you should play them in their good cards. I think a lot of people were very surprised to see how good Stormwind's Trickery is in this format, and it's just one of the top uncommons. And that's because this effect is pretty good, plus the 1/1. I think, in fact, Stormwind's Trickery is one of the cards that was underrated quite a bit early on. Just, following this trend of counterspells tend to be underrated. So don't worry too much about the counterspells as a class of cards. They are still good and limited. I would dispel the myth that they aren't, basically. It does take a little bit of deck building to be like, okay, this is a deck that's particularly good for counterspells with a bunch of instants. But most of the time, you can be pretty happy just putting these cards in your deck, and they'll just perform like you want them to. Mass pump spells. So stuff like Inspired Charge, 2 white for an instant. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Or Overcome, which is from a few years back at this point. This is 3 green for a sorcery. Creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. A lot of people saw this card and they're like, oh, it's the second coming of Overrun, which was 2 green. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. This was a card that was notoriously one of the better cards you could open in Limited back in the day. Like, just +3/+3 to your team, and trample is gigantic. Even if your board wasn't that large, you usually just won the game on the spot with it, or put your opponent in a position where they had to block with all their creatures not to die. It turns out, though, +2/+2, or just +2 attack, is a much smaller number. It changes the math enough where Overcome wasn't actually very good. And I think that the kind of residual effect of Overrun being such a strong card in years of the past has kind of echoed to today, to 2023. And I think generally mass pump spells are overrated in the sense that I see people putting them in their decks, in decks that don't belong, basically. For me to want a Overcome Inspired Charge, I have to be going wide. I have to have creatures that produce multiple bodies, or cards that produce multiple bodies. I think a lot of people think of this, maybe they don't even have the Overrun analog that they're thinking of, but people see an Inspired Charge and just go, oh, this is a good aggro finisher. I can cast this and I'll attack and push a bunch of damage. It doesn't work out the way you want it to as often as you'd like it to, though, unless you're making multiple bodies. Because what happens is, like, all right, I've got 3 creatures, you've got 3 creatures. I attack and cast my Inspired Charge after blocks. Okay, one of my creatures survived, and the other one's traded. That's just not that effective, right? If you've got a bunch of token makers, we saw this in, I think last we saw this was in Dominaria United, the red-white go-wide deck. That worked. The Inspired Charge variant, Heroic Charge, that was good, and that one gave trample too, which was kind of nice. But it worked because there was multiple cards that made multiple bodies. There was a bunch of token makers. If you don't have things that make multiple bodies, these kind of effects just aren't going to be what you're looking for. Next up, we've got equipment and auras, and specifically equipment because they've been kind of experimenting with a lot of equipment and ways to make equipment better. And my big picture thought for equipment is most of it is bad. It's a really tough card type to get right, because if it's too good, it's obnoxious because all your creatures just, for very cheap become massive or get awesome abilities. And if it's too bad, then people just won't play it, or at least in my opinion, just shouldn't play it. And it's also just a card type that inherently has the problem of it needs other cards to be good. And that's not a huge ask, right? You're going to have 16 creatures in your equipment deck a lot of the time, but it is going to punish you in some games. There are going to be some games you draw your equipment, your opponent kills your threats, the equipment's not doing anything, right? The best equipment are things like the 4 Mirrodin equipment from Phyrexia All Will Be One. If your equipment comes with a body, that solves so much of the problem that I have with equipment. So just generally, when you're evaluating equipment, really downgrade it unless it's just like an absurdly good equipment. Like, most of the time, you're not going to have a good common equipment that you're just going to want to play draft in, draft out. There are some exceptions, like there is Beamtown Beatstick from the last set. There is Goldvein Pick. Those are resource-generating equipment that are worth the trouble. But even something like Dundane Blade, or it's the 2-mana equipment from Lord of the Rings that gives +2/+1 and equips for 1 to a human. Like, 1 to equip, 2 to play, +2/+1. That's a solid equipment, and it's still not a card I think you should be playing in very many decks, just because it has the inherent problem of, well, it doesn't always line up the way you want it to. If you've got something like Bladehold Warwhip, the gold, red-white equipment from 4 Mirrodin, that card was excellent because it's a good equipment, and of course, it comes with the body. So basically, what I would say for most common equipment especially is just not good until it's proven otherwise. That's the way I generally approach it. And then last, this is another topic that I've had a few episodes before just touching around, just build-arounds. And a mark of a good build-around, I think, is the build-around. Usually it's like a build-around enchantment. The build-around gives you something up front, or gets you kickstarted on what it's asking you to do. Build around that we've talked about a bit in this episode already, Fiery Inscription. It kickstarts you by getting the ring tempt when it enters the battlefield, right? It's not exactly doing the exact same thing as when you cast instants and sorceries, you deal damage, but it is helping you tempt, which helps you see more cards because you get to the looting ability of the ring, which then helps you see more spells. So it does kickstart you in that way. Roost of Drakes from Zendikar Rising. That was, one of the better build-around enchantments we've had ever, basically. It gave you a 2/2 flyer on Enter the Battlefield, and whenever you kicked a spell, you got another 2/2 flyer. Ominous Roost. This is another one. The 2 and a blue for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, or whenever you cast a spell from your grave, you get a 1/1 bird token with flying, and that creature can't block. The flying creature can't block, but it gives you something up front. So one mark of a good build-around is you're not just playing it. It's almost like the 4 and 5 mana cards. You're not just playing it and then hoping to untap with it. It's doing something when it enters, immediate impact. That's generally a good sign of a good build around. And, again, I'm oversimplifying a little bit here. I just wanted to point out one thread I've noticed through build arounds because these are very complex and we could talk for hours about build arounds, and I have talked about hours about build arounds. Just a small note. All right, and that's going to do it. Thank you so much for hanging out on this pretty info-dense episode. Hope it was of use to you. And of course, if there's anything I missed, if there's something that you were hoping I talked about and I didn't, feel free to leave a comment. I'll do my best to reply, answer any questions. The coming weeks, we've got a few interesting episodes coming up. We've got Cube, with a Cube open, so we're definitely going to be covering that. We've got a guest or two coming up, so look forward to a guest, including one guest that I'm excited to have on that I've never had on before. And before you know it, Eldraine's going to be around the corner. It's previews for Eldraine start in like 3 weeks. So we got lots lined up for us here at Limited Level Ups. We'll, of course, be covering it all, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.